My shift at Denton's General Store started like any other. A quiet Tuesday night in the middle of a small, sleepy town. Most of our customers were regulars, people stopping by for cigarettes, snacks, or the occasional case of beer. The kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Or so I thought. It was a little after 9 p.m. when I clocked in, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as I swapped shifts with Paula, the day clerk. She gave me a tired smile, her curly hair looking even more frazzled than usual. "Slow night," she said, handing me the keys to the register. "Just the way we like it." I nodded, not expecting anything different. The store felt familiar, almost comforting, with its aisles of neatly stocked snacks and shelves of canned goods. But something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavier than usual, or how the overhead lights seemed a little dimmer. I brushed it off and settled in behind the counter, flipping through my phone to pass the time. The first few hours were uneventful, just a couple of customers coming in for gas or grabbing a late-night snack. By midnight, the store was completely empty. That's when I heard it. A faint clink from one of the aisles, like a can falling off a shelf. I looked up, frowning. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the empty store. No answer. The security cameras above the counter gave me a view of every aisle, but the grainy black and white feed showed nothing out of the ordinary. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out from behind the counter, the beam of light cutting through the dimly lit aisles. As I turned the corner into the canned goods aisle, I saw it, a single can of soup lying on the floor, rolling slightly as if it had just fallen. I picked it up, placing it back on the shelf, and shook my head. "Probably just a loose shelf," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the floor, where the can had been, was a small smudge of what looked like dirt, or maybe ash. I frowned, crouching down for a closer look. It was dark, almost black, and it smelled faintly of something metallic. I wiped it away with my shoe, trying not to overthink it, and headed back to the counter. By 2 a.m., the strange feeling hadn't gone away. The store was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that made the hum of the cooler motors seem deafening. I was scrolling through my phone again when the motion sensor for the front doors triggered. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, but no one walked in. I leaned over the counter, peering at the doors. They stayed open for a moment before closing again. Probably the wind, I thought, even though it wasn't windy. But then the doors opened again. And again. I stood, my hands clenching the edge of the counter. This time, the doors stayed open, as if someone or something was standing just outside the sensor's reach. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The doors slid shut again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But the relief didn't last long. The overhead lights flickered, plunging the store into brief darkness before buzzing back to life. When the lights came back on, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The can of soup I'd put back on the shelf earlier was sitting on the counter in front of me. I hadn't put it there. My hands shook as I picked it up, staring at it like it might explode. "Okay, very funny," I said, my voice louder now. "If someone's messing with me, it's not funny anymore." The store was silent. I placed the can under the counter, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That's when the security monitor flickered. I looked up at the screen, my heart pounding. On the grainy black and white feed, I saw something moving in the back of the store. It was faint, almost like a shadow shifting between the shelves. I froze, my eyes glued to the screen as the shadow moved closer to the camera. It stopped near the cooler in aisle 3, its shape indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. I grabbed the flashlight again, my legs feeling like lead as I stepped out from behind the counter. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet. "If you're in here, you need to leave. Now." No answer. I made my way to aisle 3, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cooler hummed softly, its glass doors reflecting my pale face back at me. But the aisle was empty. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. On the glass of the cooler door, written in fog, were 2 words. Help me. The flashlight slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor as I stumbled back. Because when I looked closer, I realized the words weren't written from the outside. They were written from the inside. The words on the glass, "Help me," had been written from the inside of the cooler. I stood there, frozen, my breath fogging up the glass as I stared at the letters. The cooler hummed softly, its fluorescent light flickering slightly, casting long shadows in the empty aisle. I didn't want to open it, but my body moved on its own, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle and pulled. A cold gust hit me as the door swung open, the faint smell of spoiled milk and damp cardboard wafting out. The shelves were full of soda cans and bottled water, neatly arranged, just like they'd been when I restocked them earlier. But at the very back, behind the bottles on the bottom shelf, something caught my eye. It was a small bundle of fabric, dark and stained, shoved into the corner. I crouched down, my hand shaking as I reached for it. The fabric was damp, and as I pulled it closer, the faint metallic smell grew stronger. When I unfolded it, my stomach lurched. It was a shirt, a child's shirt, stained with dried blood. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I dropped the shirt like it had burned me, stumbling back into the shelf behind me. The bottles rattled, one falling and shattering on the floor, the sound echoing through the empty store. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I turned, scanning the aisle, but it was empty. Then the lights flickered again, plunging the store into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the words on the glass were gone. But something else was there. A wet footprint, smeared across the linoleum floor, leading away from the cooler and disappearing into the next aisle. My heart hammered as I followed it, each step feeling heavier than the last. The footprint led to the far corner of the store, near the cleaning supplies. As I rounded the corner, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the aisle, its back to me. It was tall and hunched, its shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Its clothes were tattered, and its skin was pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights. "Hey!" I shouted, gripping the flashlight tightly. The figure didn't move. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but you need to leave right now." Still no response. I took a step closer, the sound of my own breathing loud in the silence. "Turn around," I said, my voice shaking. The figure moved then, but not like I expected. It didn't turn slowly or deliberately. It twisted violently, its head snapping toward me with a sickening crack. Its face was obscured by a mess of hair and dirt, but its eyes were wide and unblinking, bloodshot and sunken deep into its skull. And its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, the skin around it cracked and bleeding. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then it started moving toward me, its steps uneven and jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to keep it steady. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The figure didn't stop. It let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a laugh. Panicking, I swung the flashlight as hard as I could. It connected with the side of its head, the sound of the impact echoing through the aisle. The figure staggered, letting out a shriek that made my ears ring. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at me, its hands clawing at my shirt as I fell backward onto the floor. I kicked out desperately, my foot connecting with its chest and sending it stumbling back. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed a can of cleaning spray from the shelf and sprayed it directly into its face. It shrieked again, clawing at its eyes as it stumbled into the shelf, knocking over bottles and boxes. Taking the opportunity, I ran. I bolted out of the aisle, my heart pounding as I headed for the front door. But when I reached the counter, I stopped dead in my tracks. The can of soup was sitting there again, right in the center of the counter. And beside it was the child's bloody shirt, neatly folded. The store was silent, the oppressive air pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't leave." I turned toward the front door, and my blood ran cold. The doors were sealed shut, and written across the glass in smeared, dark red letters were two words. Stay here. The words smeared across the glass, stay here, made my blood turn to ice. I stepped back from the doors, my mind racing. The automatic doors had locked somehow, the usual hum of the sensors replaced by an eerie stillness. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it. I dialed 911, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the line connected. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in the store, I said, my voice cracking. They attacked me, and now I'm locked in. The operator's tone remained calm. Are you injured? No, but... Before I could finish, the lights flickered again, plunging the store into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the voice on the line was gone, replaced by static. Hello, I said, my voice rising in panic. Are you still there? The static grew louder, more distorted, until it cut out completely. I stared at the phone, disbelief washing over me. How could the call have dropped? The oppressive silence of the store closed in around me. I forced myself to move, heading back to the counter to check the landline. But when I reached it, the phone was gone. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had just seen the phone there earlier. Where could it have gone? My thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of boots against the linoleum floor. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't coming from behind me. They were coming from above. The ceiling of the store was a patchwork of old tiles, some sagging slightly from years of wear. The footsteps echoed across the ceiling, moving toward the back of the store. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, gripping it tightly as I moved cautiously down the aisles. The sound stopped abruptly as I reached the storage room door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out from inside. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The storage room was empty, rows of metal shelves lined with boxes and supplies. But something was wrong. One of the shelves had been moved, its contents scattered across the floor. Behind it was a small, square opening, a crawl space leading up into the ceiling. My stomach sank. The ladder leading to the crawl space was old and rusted, its steps creaking under the weight of whoever had climbed it. I shone the flashlight into the opening, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Who's up there? I said, my voice firmer this time. Still no response. A loud crash from the front of the store made me jump, the sound reverberating through the storage room. I backed away from the ladder, my heart racing as I turned and ran back toward the counter. When I reached the front, my stomach lurched. The shelves near the entrance had been tipped over, their contents spilled across the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the mess was a mannequin dressed in a store uniform, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. A name tag was pinned to its chest. My name tag. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the scattered items on the floor. The mannequin's lifeless eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, its frozen smile mocking my fear. I spun around, searching for any sign of the intruder. The store was silent again, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I moved quickly, heading for the breaker box in the back to see if I could unlock the doors manually. The box was mounted on the wall near the storage room, its metal surface dented and scratched from years of use. I flipped open the cover, my fingers fumbling with the switches. But as I reached for the main breaker, I froze. Scratched into the inside of the cover were 3 words. He sees you. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. Whoever was doing this wasn't just toying with me. They were watching me, and they were still here. I backed away from the breaker box, the flashlight shaking in my hand. From somewhere deep in the store, I heard it again, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. This time they were coming closer. The footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate, echoing through the aisles like a countdown. I pressed my back against the wall near the breaker box, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Whoever was in the store wasn't trying to hide anymore. They wanted me to know they were coming. I forced myself to move, slipping around the corner and creeping toward the counter. The plan was simple. Grab the emergency phone hidden under the register and call the police again. But as I neared the counter, I froze. Someone was standing on the other side. The figure was hunched over, their shoulders rising and falling like they were out of breath. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow on their silhouette, distorting their features. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Who are you? What do you want?" Slowly, they straightened up, their movements unnatural, like they weren't used to standing upright. When they turned to face me, my blood ran cold. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, with deep-set eyes that burned with an intensity that made my stomach churn. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hands caked with grime. But it was his expression that unsettled me the most. He was smiling. Not the kind of smile you'd give a stranger or even a friend. It was wide, unnatural, and full of malice. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "This is private property," I said, trying to sound firm. "You need to leave, or I'll call the cops." His smile widened. "They won't get here in time," he said, taking a step closer. I raised the flashlight, holding it between us like a shield. "Stay back." He stopped, tilting his head like a curious animal. "You don't understand," he said, his tone almost playful. "This place belongs to me now." His words sent a chill down my spine. "This is a store," I said, my voice shaking. "It doesn't belong to anyone." He laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the empty aisles. "Oh, it belongs to me," he said, his smile fading. "And you're trespassing." Before I could respond, he lunged. I swung the flashlight, the metal casing connecting with his arm and sending him stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I bolted toward the storage room, my legs moving on instinct. Behind me, I could hear him laughing, the sound growing louder as he chased after me. I slammed the storage room door shut and shoved a heavy shelf against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But the laughter didn't stop. It was coming from above. My eyes darted to the crawlspace. The opening was dark, the ladder still leaning against the wall. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, like it was echoing in my head. I grabbed a nearby broom and shoved it up into the crawlspace, my pulse racing. "Get out of here," I shouted. The broom hit nothing but air. Then the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, my ears straining to pick up any sound. I lowered the broom, my hands slick with sweat, and that's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the back of the storage room. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shelves were still, their contents undisturbed. But at the very back of the room, near the old delivery door, something was moving. It was subtle at first, like fabric brushing against metal. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. "Come on," I muttered, smacking the side of the flashlight. The beam steadied just in time to reveal a pair of eyes staring back at me from the shadows. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a kind of rage I'd never seen before. "You shouldn't have stayed," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the light, a rusted crowbar clutched tightly in his hands. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I grabbed a heavy box from the nearest shelf and hurled it at him. The box hit his shoulder, and he let out a grunt, but he didn't stop. He swung the crowbar, the metal glinting in the dim light as it smashed into the shelf beside me. I ducked, the impact sending shards of wood and metal flying. Desperation took over as I sprinted toward the delivery door, fumbling with the lock. Behind me, the man's footsteps grew louder, his breaths ragged and uneven. The lock finally gave, and I shoved the door open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I ran into the alley, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep going. When I finally turned around, The door to the store was swinging shut, and the man was nowhere to be seen. But I knew he wasn't gone. Somewhere in the dark, his laughter echoed, a chilling reminder that this wasn't over. I didn't go back to the store the next day, or the day after that. Every time I tried to explain what had happened, the words got caught in my throat. The police were polite but skeptical, the kind of attitude that said they'd heard crazier stories before. Just a drifter, they told me. Maybe someone squatting in the building after hours. We'll check it out. I wanted to believe them, but the laughter still echoed in my ears. And the way he moved, the way he looked at me, it wasn't the behavior of someone just looking for a place to crash. 2 days later, my manager called. "Do you want me to cover your shift again?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. I hesitated. "No," I said finally. "I'll go in." The thought of stepping back into that store made my stomach churn, but I couldn't keep running from it. When I arrived for my shift, the store was just as I'd left it. The aisles were neatly stocked, the floors clean, the automatic doors opening and closing smoothly. But the air felt heavy. I moved behind the counter, checking the register and glancing up at the security monitors. The grainy black and white screens showed an empty store. The first few hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the coolers and the faint sound of cars passing outside. Around midnight, the power flickered again. It only lasted a second, but it was enough to make my heart race. The store settled back into quiet, but the unease lingered. I busied myself restocking shelves, trying to keep my mind occupied. But as I reached the back of the store, I noticed something that made me stop cold. The crawl space. The ladder had been moved. It was no longer propped up against the wall. Instead, it was lying on the floor, as if it had been thrown down in a hurry. My pulse quickened as I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the opening. The narrow tunnel was empty, but the faint smell of rust and damp would lingered. I backed away, my hands trembling. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Someone was standing in the reflection of the cooler door, watching me from the next aisle. I turned quickly, the flashlight beam darting across the shelves. But the aisle was empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The sound of footsteps echoed through the store, moving quickly now, their direction impossible to pin down. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as I tried to keep the flashlight steady. Then the sound stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned toward the front of the store, my breath catching in my throat. The man was standing behind the counter, his dirty clothes and wild eyes illuminated by the glow of the register. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice low and venomous. I couldn't move. "I told you to leave," he continued, stepping out from behind the counter. "You don't belong here." I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my mind racing. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice trembling. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think you have a choice?" Before I could respond, he lunged. I swung the flashlight, but he caught my wrist, twisting it painfully until the flashlight clattered to the floor. We struggled, his grip like iron as he shoved me against the shelves. "Do you know what happens to trespassers?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. Desperation surged through me, and I grabbed a can from the shelf, smashing it into his temple. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the flashlight and run. I bolted toward the front door, the sound of his footsteps close behind. When I reached the doors, I slammed my hand against the emergency release button. The doors groaned, but they didn't open. Panic set in as I turned, ready to fight. But the man was gone. The store was silent again, the oppressive stillness making my skin crawl. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam darting across the aisles. Then I saw it. A trail of muddy footprints leading toward the storage room. I followed them, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the storage room, the door was slightly open. I pushed it slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the shelves were overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room was a pile of clothes, torn and blood-stained. On top of the pile was a photograph. It was of me, taken from behind as I stocked the shelves earlier that night. The police never found him. They said he must have been a drifter, someone passing through town.